Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk on the post-pandemic surge in rural house prices. Before we get to today's talk, I just want to highlight a couple of other upcoming talks. We have a very busy schedule through the end of February and the first part of March. On Friday, February 27th, we will be having an online roundtable discussion on using design competitions to improve the quality of housing. It'll start with a presentation by Suzanne Schindler, a JCHS research fellow who wrote a recent working paper on this subject, and continue with a panel of practitioners and officials from Greater Boston. An edited version of this conversation will be part of the next State of Housing Design publication, which will be released in early 2027. Not quite a week later, on Thursday, March 6th, Kenzie Bach, the administrator of the Boston Housing Authority, will give the 25th annual John T. Dunlop Lecture. She'll be speaking on the past, present, and future of public housing. That'll be both in person at the Graduate School of Design at 6:30, and online. The following day at 12:15 p.m., Justin Katz, a Meyer doctoral fellow, will be speaking about center-supported research he did, which resulted in his job market paper, Did Mortgage Rate Locks Lead to Rising House Prices? Should be a very interesting presentation. And finally, on Thursday, March 12th at 4 o'clock, we'll be releasing the 2026 America's Rental Housing Report. That is one of our signature reports, comes out about every 2 years. More information about those and many other upcoming events is available on our website and, of course, through our weekly emails. Now on to today's event. Our speakers today are Alex Hermann and Peyton Whitney, two researchers here at the Joint Center. They are co-authors of a recent Joint Center working paper examining and unpacking the unprecedented rise of home prices in rural areas during the pandemic. Alex will start, and then he'll turn things over to Peyton. Together, they'll speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then they'll take questions again together for about 15 minutes. I'll moderate. Please use Zoom's Q&A to submit your questions. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions, but we will share all of them with our presenters. We'll wrap up at 1:30 p.m. A video and copies of the slides will be posted on our website early next week. Alex, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. I'm going to move my stuff around here for a second as it looks like Peyton's already sharing the slides. So we've got that done. Thank you for inviting us here to present this work that we're super proud of and super excited to be sharing with you all today. This presentation is really the culmination of two different projects that we'll touch on, both of which are really trying to understand the geography of home price growth that happened during and then in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. So the paper we released at the end of last year that David mentioned is on home price trends in rural areas specifically, and that'll be our primary focus here today. That paper is titled in the slide in front of you, Rural Housing Shift, Vacation Area Home Prices Surge Post-Pandemic. And I want to start us off with the things that matter most. So these are the key points, the key findings from our paper and from today's presentation. So if there's anything we want you to learn from us today, it's this. And first of all, it's that home prices in rural areas increase significantly, driven by shifting migration patterns. So a large number of people started moving into rural areas, far more than started moving out for the first time in over a decade, and that helped to push up home prices in rural areas overall significantly. A key part of this paper is unpacking what kinds of rural places saw the fastest home price appreciation. And what we find pretty immediately is that prices surged in vacation areas, especially. But more than that, really, prices rose generally, regardless of the level of urbanization. So beyond vacation areas, prices rose significantly in places with lower and higher densities, in places with smaller and larger urban populations, in places that were close to metro areas, and further away all at the same time. Third, when we start to kind of control for differences in some of the regression models that we run across rural counties, first of all, we reaffirm that finding that vacation areas saw the most significant home price appreciation. But really, even beyond that, we also see prices grow more in counties that are near or abutting metro areas and in more lower density communities. And then fourth of all, and Peyton will touch more on this, there's a need to address, given the surge in home prices, some of the affordability implications, especially for lower income households, especially for existing residents, and especially for seasonal workers, many of whom work and live in some of these vacation counties. Here's just a roadmap of where we're going today. I'll discuss the background and the data and methods. Then I'll bring in my colleague and co-author, Peyton, and she'll really discuss the meat of the analysis. She'll talk about the drivers of rural home price growth, how these trends played out in different types of rural communities, and then get into those implications and conclusions. Let's get into the background a bit and talk a bit more about what motivated this project. I think the place to begin is with national home price trends. So this is an update of a figure we publish in the State of the Nation's Housing almost every year right now, given the importance of home prices generally, of course, but really, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. So the line here is just an index value, and that shows you the month-to-month change in prices. And then that red area shows the year-over-year increase, the year-over-year annual change in home price growth. By every measure, home prices exploded after the start of the pandemic. And by this measure in particular, prices rose almost 40% in the 3 years following March 2020. And then if you look at where annual home price appreciation peaked, it peaked at about 21% in early 2022. So this unprecedented increase in home prices overall in the entire country is really where our story begins. So in our first paper, we wanted to see how these home price trends played out in different market types across the country. And there's been some really good work that's been done on this by others, but not quite what we wanted. So we looked at how home values increase in these different kinds of geographies. Most importantly, in the 3 years after the start of the pandemic, and then compared that to the 3 years immediately preceding. We found that after 2020, home prices rose most in lower density market types. So home values rose 36.5% in the lower density suburbs of large metro areas. They rose 36.5% in smaller markets with under 1 million people, and they rose about 36.5% again in rural and non-metro areas. In the second paper and in our presentation today, we'll focus on the far right side of this graph. We're going to dig deeper into the home price trends in non-metro and rural counties in particular. So by way of background, I think it's important to consider and set the table by discussing some of the factors that drove home price growth during this period. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but it's 5 or so interrelated factors that I'll touch on here. So on the housing demand side, average mortgage interest rates plummeted to all-time lows fairly early in the pandemic. So as early as July 2020, mortgage rates had fallen to under 3% and stayed in that range through the end of 2021. And at the same time, many households were spending less of their money during the pandemic as a combination of local restrictions and the COVID virus itself, of course, kept many people at home and away from places like restaurants, bars, barbershop. It kept them from traveling, right? Just many, many, many places that they might otherwise be spending money at. And then at the same time, a more robust social safety net. So a couple of different economic impact or stimulus payments went out to most households across the country. There was more generous unemployment insurance. This combination of factors, right, helped to boost savings for many households. So while interest rates were low and savings rates were really high, the large cohort of millennials continued to age deeper into their 30s, right? And these are traditionally peak home buying years. So collectively, all three of these factors boosted demand for housing and helped to push up home prices. On the supply side, more than a decade of underbuilding followed the housing bust and financial crisis of the mid 2000s. So, in other words, we built much less new housing in the almost 15 years before the pandemic than we had in any previous era. And that contributed to record low inventories of homes for sale. So few homes really became available, but just as importantly, any home that hit the market was bought up immediately, right? I think we all know the horror stories of that era where a home would get listed and within 2 days you'd get 20, 30, 40 offers, some of them all cash. And that was playing out in markets all across the country. So with so few homes, so many buyers, and such low interest rates, home buyers were able to bid up home prices at this record high rate. So importantly, all these factors really held true across the entire country, right? And it's hard to say how any of them would be especially meaningful for pushing up home prices in rural areas. So instead, what factors really drove up home prices in lower density communities? And by our telling, it's really the rise in remote work and the resulting shift in migration patterns that is the biggest driver of higher home price growth in non-metro and lower density areas. So this played out in a couple of different ways. I think first and foremost, people who could work remotely could now live further from their place of employment, right? So if you have less frequent commutes or no commute at all, right, these households might be more willing and able to live in these lower density areas. And in any case, these are the households who all of a sudden have more flexibility to kind of live where they want. And then a second factor, I think, for those working remotely is it created the need for additional space for a home office or for some kind of workspace. And that additional space for these households was going to be easier to find, and in many cases, a little bit more affordable in communities that were further afield, like in rural areas. So to see how this played out, we'll look at the data. These are estimates from the Census Bureau, and they show the number and share of people who usually worked from home the week prior to being surveyed. We look at the 4 years before the pandemic and the 4 years after in 2020. 2020 has some famously bad data, so we exclude it from this chart here. But if you look in 2019, under 9 million people usually worked from home in a given week, and that's about 6% of the workforce. By 2021, those numbers had tripled to almost 28 million people and about 18% of the workforce. And as you can see, these numbers have remained elevated well above pre-pandemic levels into the mid-2020s. I'll note before we move on that this is a lower bound estimate of remote work. The way the question in this survey is asked is about how survey respondents usually worked or commuted to work the prior week. So this question doesn't quite capture households who work remotely a few times a week or for some period of the year where they weren't surveyed, right? But even these kinds of remote work situations that aren't captured here can influence home buying and housing choices. I'll also note that people who work remotely tend to be higher income, right? These tend to be white collar workers who work in certain kinds of professions. So they don't just have more flexibility in terms of where they can live in these cases, but they also have the resources they need to move there, even in more constrained or challenging market environments like we saw in 2020 and 2021. So this is another figure we've used pretty regularly in the State of the Nation's Housing Report. And I think this comes directly from the State of the Nation's Housing Report last year. And it shows how net domestic migration has shifted across market types before and since the pandemic. So you see on the left-hand side that net domestic migration was already negative in 2019 in the denser urban counties of large metro areas. And that became even more negative in 2021 and 2022. So what does this mean? This means that more people moved out of than into these counties. And that trend only became more pronounced after the pandemic. Where do these domestic migrants go instead? If you look on the right side of the chart, the right side of the figure, net domestic inflows accelerated, but especially in smaller markets and especially in non-metro counties. And in non-metro counties and rural counties, domestic migration was actually negative before the pandemic, but flipped to positive in 2021 and has stayed there through 2024 at least. So, in summary, home prices rose rapidly across the country for a number of demand and supply related reasons. That's interest rates, it's demographic factors, it's limited available supply. That all helped to push up home values across the US pretty much everywhere at a record high rate. But remote work really enabled and even incentivized many households who tended to be higher income to move into these lower density communities. But for this project, why do we focus on rural areas in particular? So I think rural areas have a number of unique challenges that make them worthy of study in their own right. So this is not just true in rural areas or not true in rural areas everywhere, but in general, rural areas have lower levels of economic activity and lower levels of economic diversity. And what I mean is, right, these areas have less economic output overall, fewer job opportunities that come along with that, and more concentration in select industries. So think tourism, think agriculture, energy, manufacturing, things like that. And as a result, rural areas tend to have higher rates of poverty and lower incomes overall. Rural areas also tend to be lower density, and this can help limit access to numerous kinds of public and private services, right? Think transportation and the dearth of transportation opportunities that are usually available in rural areas. Think healthcare and hospital access. Think in some cases even food and childcare. So limited access to services related to lower densities. Rural areas also face distinct home building challenges. So there's a shortage of construction labor broadly in the US, and this was a challenge, especially during the pandemic when home building activity increased significantly. But it can be especially acute in rural markets where the labor supply has a lower baseline to begin with. There's just less labor supply available in these areas. Infrastructure development like roads, water, sewer systems, right, are also a particular concern in rural areas. And that's due to the lack of connectivity to existing systems, due to the costs of that development, as well as financing challenges. And then you have fewer large home builders who operate in rural areas overall. So rural markets are more reliant on smaller builders who might have less capacity, less ability to find financing for projects, and be less equipped to deal with some of these infrastructure and labor challenges that we're talking about. And that all makes home building not impossible, obviously, but difficult to do at scale. And then finally, a particular challenge that was especially true during the pandemic was demand for second and vacation homes, which rose to an all-time high in 2020 and 2021. So the need for space, lower rates, higher savings, these all affected the primary home buying market, as we talked about, but they're also an accelerant in the second home market. So not all these homes, of course, are in rural areas, but a large share of them are in rural areas, and that created particular difficulties for these communities during the pandemic. So with that background out of the way, our focus in this paper is to explore the many dimensions of rural home price growth, in particular, what kinds of rural areas saw the most rapid price appreciation, what drove that appreciation, and what does it all mean for the people who live there, right? So specifically, the research questions we address, what were the demand and supply challenges? I'm sorry, demand and supply drivers of rural home price growth in the aftermath of the pandemic. What rural areas experienced the most rapid home price appreciation, which saw less price appreciation, and then what characteristics of rural areas are associated with higher and lower price growth. Before I turn it over to Peyton, I'm going to discuss a little bit about how we answered these questions. For starters, we used two data sources primarily. First, we used a measure of typical home value from Zillow at the county level. We can think of this functionally as a median. It's a little bit different. It's the average or the mean of the middle of the distribution, but for our purposes, a median is probably good enough right now. We look primarily at three time periods. So we look at the month of March for 2017, 2020, and 2023, which encompasses the peak of that pandemic home buying market that I showed you previously, as well as a corresponding 3-year period preceding the start of the pandemic. And then our descriptive statistics, we estimate the average typical home value across these different county types in these 3 periods. And we weight that by the number of homeowners in each county to make it more broadly representative. And then we report out percent changes or changes over these time periods in these different places. The second primary data source is the American Community Survey, and we have data from the ACS for every county in the country. This gives us a rich set of demographic, economic, and housing unit characteristics, which really help us to explore the variation in home price growth in different kinds of rural places. And then we use these other data sources also to discuss the drivers of rural home price growth, particularly domestic migration and immigration, the incomes and characteristics of home buyers, and single family construction or single family building permits. We're not going to get into the details of that right now, but happy to answer questions if you have them. For our presentation here, what is rural? Rural areas are all counties outside of metropolitan areas. It's an imperfect definition of rural in some ways, but very convenient for the county level data that we have, and a very common proxy for rural and housing research and housing related programs and policies. So non-metro counties include communities like the one you see in the photo here, but also smaller towns, places that might look or might even be more urban. But again, it's a reasonable and a good proxy. Because we don't have data for every county in every year, our sample of rural counties includes just 1,800 of the about 1,950 non-metro counties in the country. But these counties do contain about 99% of the population living in non-metro areas. So our sample is fairly close to representative, or fairly close to comprehensive, I should say. Because the purpose of this project is to examine the kinds of rural places that saw the most rapid price appreciation, we categorize counties by several different dimensions. So some of these relate to the level of urbanization or rurality of the county. In particular, we're looking at the county's population density, its adjacency to a metro area, whether or not it abuts or doesn't abut a metro area, the size of the urban population, and the average commute time to work for residents of that county. Urban populations are defined by the Census Bureau and correlate pretty tightly with density. So these are people who live in urban areas that reach a certain density threshold, but this definition also factors in non-residential land uses and connectivity to urban places. So it's about density, but not just about density. Um, in this presentation, on the next slide, we'll talk about counties or spaces that are less urban, more rural, or places that are more urban or less rural, somewhat interchangeably, right? So what do we mean by that? I think it's important to say. A county in this framework, if you look to the right-hand side of the figure that is more urban or less rural, will tend to have higher densities. It'll tend to be adjacent to a metro area. It'll have a larger urban population, and it'll have shorter commute times, right? So these are just some of the common ways that rural areas are defined or distinguished. And these give us some framework for thinking about the kinds of places that have different kinds of home price growth. But the most important categorization in this presentation is going to be vacation counties, which are extremely significant for understanding rural home price trends during this period. So we define these vacation counties as any non-metro county where 20% of the housing stock or more is vacant and held for seasonal, recreational, or occasional use. And that just means that these counties have a lot of vacation and second homes. So vacation counties encompass about 256 non-metro counties, or about 14% of our sample. And in practice, these counties have high natural amenity values and large tourism industries. So these counties are known for their nature, their skiing, their lakes, as well as their tourism, right? Some of them are fairly well off enclaves for higher income people also. Not true for all of them, but some of them are fairly well known. I'll give you an example that I think helps illustrate. So Charlevoix County is in my home state of Michigan, in northern Michigan, on the west side of the state, along Lake Michigan. And it's really well known in the state for its lakes and its lake homes, right? Eagle County, Colorado, or so I'm told, not much of a skier, but is a prominent mountain town and ski area outside of Breckenridge that includes Vail, Colorado, right? For New Englanders, Hancock County in Maine includes Acadia National Park and Bar Harbor. And then Sierra County in Northern California is just outside Lake Tahoe. So I think and hope that gives you a sense of what kind of counties we're talking about. If you map these vacation counties, it also helps reveal some important patterns. So this map here shows you all of the non-metro counties across the country, including those in our sample in that kind of, I don't know, yellow, light orange, whatever that is. And then the darker red, darker orange are the vacation counties in our sample. So vacation counties exist in every region, but they're especially concentrated in New England. They're especially concentrated in the upper Midwest along the Great Lakes, and they're especially concentrated in the Mountain West along some of those mountain and ski towns we mentioned. I will also note here that vacation counties are distinct from other counties in our sample. So compared to other non-metro counties, vacation counties are higher cost and have higher home values. And that requires, in many cases, higher incomes and higher rates of educational attainment to actually access them. The population living in these vacation counties tend to be older and less racially and ethnically diverse. And then these counties also have lower levels of urbanization, meaning they tend to be less dense, they tend to have smaller urban populations, and they tend to be less adjacent or less likely to be adjacent to metro areas. And that'll be important for later on when Peyton digs into the analysis. And I guess that's a good segue to bring on Peyton now to talk about the analysis. So
All right. Thank you so much, Alex, for that great setup. That is super helpful as I will dive into the analysis a bit, and just talk through some answers to our research questions. So, as Alex described, there were many factors that contributed to the national rise in home prices during the pandemic. But we wanted to look at rural areas specifically, to understand the underlying demand and supply drivers for these non-metro home price trends, right? As Alex mentioned before, the most important factor in demand that we looked at was shifting domestic migration trends. These were really a major demand driver during the pandemic. So what we see in this chart is, which is showing levels of domestic migration. We see that in 2021, far more people were moving into non-metro areas than in moving out of them. And this was for the first time in more than a decade. Um, so, as we said, this is likely due to remote work opportunities really allowing households to move to more remote communities. And just to give you a idea of the scale of this shift, an important stat that we found was, from 2017 through 2019, non-metro counties lost around 78,000 US residents on net. But then when you look between 2021 and 2023, these same places gained 540,000 domestic migrants. So it's really a substantial shift in the demand factors in these communities, right? We also looked at rates of net domestic migration. So this is a slightly different measure than overall levels. It's used for comparison over time. It's showing a percent change in this instance. We looked across various characteristics of rural counties and found that rates of domestic migration were highest, also where home price appreciation was highest, where it was, yeah, most rapid and substantial. And we also found that rates of domestic migration were highest in vacation counties, at more than twice the rate of the pre-pandemic levels. We also looked at several other factors underlying these price trends, for demand and supply. I won't go into the most amount of detail in this presentation, but I'll just touch on a few of them. If you're interested, there's a lot more detail in the paper, though. We'd love if you would go check it out. So first off, international immigration, it can be a super important housing demand factor. And we did find that it increased between 2021 and 2023, But it was substantially less pronounced than domestic migration. And it was relatively uniform across county types, whether they had more or less rural characteristics. So it was just, we think, less influential in these price growth trends than net domestic migration. Um, we also looked at the profile of homebuyers in rural and vacation areas to understand who was buying homes during the pandemic, right? We found that homebuyer incomes grew significantly, and especially in vacation counties. Just to give you an example, the median income of a homebuyer in vacation counties in 2023 was $125,000. This was up by 34% since 2019. Uh, and both the median income of buyers in these markets in rural vacation areas, it was higher than in metro areas overall. And the rate of increase between 2019 and 2023, it was far faster in that median income of home buyers. So we think what's going on is that remote work opportunities are allowing these much higher income folks to move increasingly into these high natural amenity spaces. They're willing to pay a premium to live there, and this is allowing them to really bid up home prices in these places. Um, Finally, we looked at single family construction trends. So single family permitting activity did grow substantially in non-metro counties after 2020, and especially in vacation areas. But we found that the rate of the construction was far lower than in metro areas, and this is due to some of those unique barriers to expanding the supply that Alex described earlier, right? So there's certainly, yeah, additional underlying demand and supply drivers that are unique to these rural places. So, with this substantial demographic shift in mind, and the other demand and supply drivers, we'll just explore a bit how much home prices rose in non-metro counties, the geographic variance of home price appreciation, and which characteristics mattered most for higher growth. Our first finding from analyzing where home prices grew fastest after the beginning of the pandemic was that rural areas saw incredibly rapid growth. So I'll reiterate this. We've talked about this a bit before, but just looking at metro and non-metro counties across the country, we evaluated the average home values for each of these county types and then looked at the percent change in those home values. And what you see is before the pandemic in the 3 years immediately preceding March of 2020, metro and non-metro home values grew at relatively similar rates, so around 17%. And then immediately following the onset of the pandemic, non-metro home value growth just pulled away, completely outpaced that of metro areas, and rose by about 36% compared to 31% in metro areas overall. Um, and this chart shows the change in average home values in only non-metro counties, but for all census regions. So we see here that this same trend of really accelerated growth in non-metro counties after the start of the pandemic, this holds true across all regions in the country. And it was really just widespread rapid growth by over 30% in every region. And it really just dwarfs the rate of growth seen in the pre-pandemic period. But this was especially true in the West and Northeast, where home values rose by over 40% on average. And here we have a county map of the whole US. This is for every non-metro county in the country. It displays their home price growth between March 2020 and 2023. And what we really notice from looking at this first off, is there is absolutely just widespread growth after the beginning of the pandemic across the country. So over 60% of these non-metro counties that we studied had home prices rise by over 30% in that period following the pandemic, the start of the pandemic, I should say. Just 17% of rural counties had prices rise more modestly by under 20%, including only 2% of counties where prices actually declined over this period. And the more modest growth was relatively contained to the South and Midwest. There is some geographic concentration, right? The highest growth counties being in the Northeast, in Maine and New Hampshire. Highest growth over 50% in those 3 years. Just incredible. We also see that though in the West, around Idaho. But overall, yes, just really rapid growth in many counties across the country. So thinking more about characteristics of these places with faster home price growth, non-metro counties with high shares of vacation homes stood out as being the most important factor, which Alex has described a bit before, but I'll get into some more detail. Vacation counties really were just, we found unique places during the pandemic. You can see in this chart showing for all non-metro counties, it's divided into vacation and non-vacation counties, which are all other rural counties in our sample. So vacation and non-vacation counties saw home prices appreciate at pretty similar rates, around 16-17% before the onset of the pandemic. And then really home prices in vacation areas just pulled away after that date in the 3 years following the start, rising by over 47% in that time. Meanwhile, other rural counties still saw home prices appreciate by about 33%. But yeah, there's a clear significant discrepancy between these two types of counties in the later period. And we see that this holds true across all census regions. So just looking at the period after the start of the pandemic, looking at the change in average home values, vacation home prices they appreciated much faster than all other rural county home prices. Of course, there's some variance across census regions with, again, the West and Northeast vacation counties standing out. Yeah, the prices there grew by at least 50% in both of those regions on average. So we also investigated, though, some other characteristics of rural areas. We wanted to see how home prices rose on average along those dimensions of urbanization that Alex enumerated earlier in the presentation. So we looked at the change in average home values, the percent change across a variety of urban rural characteristics, really. So if we're looking from the lowest density to the highest population density non-metro counties, right? And also the counties that have the shortest commute times up to the longest commute times. Across all of these characteristics, though, home prices grew by between 34 and 38%, no matter where you were in that scale of urbanization. So just really widespread, substantial growth was seen both in, for example, rural counties that were right next to a metro area, very easily connected, but also those that were more far removed. So we're not really able to discern a strong relationship just from looking at these national averages, I would say, but home values clearly grew rapidly everywhere across these rural areas. All right, so given how unique vacation areas are, and to isolate how certain rural characteristics are actually associated with higher or lower home price growth, we needed to construct a statistical model to control for differences across these rural areas. So earlier in the analysis, we've only been looking really at average home values nationally and their percent changes. But now we're switching to a model to control for various county level characteristics. We constructed a multiple linear regression model with the dependent variable being the percent change in home value between March of 2020 and 2023. This is for each county in our sample, so about 1,800 counties. And we needed to control for all sorts of county differences, right? This is a brief list of the control variables that we brought into our models based on some previous background in literature. This is not an exhaustive list, though. There's, some other important factors. And if you would like to see a full list and full iterations of the model, that's all available in our paper. So I'll just present results from from our model in its final form. I'll show you the control variables they're all running in the background of this. This is only showing the important rural characteristics that we really care about, that we wanted to understand the associations with home price growth. So for this, again, the dependent variable is the change in percent change in home prices post-pandemic. And the coefficients here show the estimated association with that home price outcome variable for these important rural characteristics. And in this chart, the stars indicate significance of the estimated coefficients. So 1 star means significance at the 5% level, 2 stars is significance at the 1% level. So after all of that background, though, what we see in these model results really, most importantly, is that vacation counties stand out again as as the most important indicator of higher home price growth, right? So this does confirm our initial results that we saw in just descriptive statistics. So here, vacation county is just a binary variable. So the interpretation of this coefficient is that being a vacation county was associated with an additional 5 percentage points higher home price growth than a non-vacation county, holding all else equal in this instance. And this was highly significant. So this was an extremely important indicator of higher home price growth in this pandemic era. Other estimates with significance at the 5% level indicate that counties with smaller urban populations and lower population densities were associated with higher levels of home price growth as well. So finally, we compared those model results to another model with a different dependent variable. So in the middle column, you'll see that those are the results for this different dependent variable model, which is the percent change in home prices in the earlier 3-year period. On the right side, that model is all of the content I just showed you in the previous slide. So we're just comparing them side by side, only to look at the signs and significance on the estimates as the actual magnitude of the estimates. We can't directly compare them because those dependent variables are different. But what I would say stands out as important from this table is that in the earlier period model, vacation counties, the estimate is not statistically significant. So this is a change, obviously, from in the later model. That means that the estimate is actually not statistically different from 0. And that what is really important is this later period. That is when vacation counties really stand out as an important characteristic in determining higher home price growth in these rural places. So I'll just leave you with some conclusions and implications of these findings, right? Just to reiterate super briefly, we tracked home prices in rural areas, and we saw that they just increased so rapidly after the start of the pandemic. I think exploded was a great term to describe this trend, right? And this was really driven by shifting migration patterns. It was very different than before the pandemic and before remote work became so prevalent for our population. We found that prices surged in vacation areas, especially, and they rose generally regardless of the level of urbanization, whether a rural county had more or less urban characteristics didn't matter much. Home prices rose substantially across the board when we're looking at the nationally, yeah, at just averages. And then, of course, when we controlled for various differences across these rural counties, vacation areas stood out as being the most important indicator. But also, we were able to discern a bit more of a relationship with those urbanized characteristics, right? So we found that prices grew a little bit more near metro areas and in lower density communities. Um, so what this means, though, is that affordability has become a much more pressing problem for people who have lived in these rural areas for a while, people who have maybe lower incomes, and the seasonal workforce that is living in oftentimes the vacation rural counties, right? So, rising home prices in vacation counties in particular present challenges for a seasonal workforce, and in rural areas in general for the existing residents with potentially more modest incomes. So, just thinking about vacation counties, and the affordability implications in those sorts of places, again, the median income for people active in the home buying market in vacation counties in 2023 was $125,000. But compare that to the median income for all households in vacation counties in 2019. We use this as a proxy for longtime residents of these areas. It's less than half of the median income of people who are buying homes in these vacation areas. So there's really significant implications for who is actually able to engage in that market and enter home ownership. If you are a person who's been calling that community home for a long time, for most of your life, right? So there's definitely need for affordability mechanisms. This could include property tax abatements, which are key for older adults on a fixed income or for lower income households, even if they own their homes outright. Rising property values in their community can be increasing property tax burdens on household budgets. So this is a key helping factor. We may also think of lower income renters in these areas as pandemic era migration shifts similarly exerted pressure on rural rental markets, undoubtedly. Um, and housing vouchers are an important tool for lower income renters to combat rising costs and yeah, help with those budgets, right? Um, and finally, when considering first-time homebuyers, especially existing residents, as home prices rise, so does the cost of a down payment. So first-time homebuyer assistance programs can be especially helpful to overcome that hurdle and to get prospective buyers into home ownership. Of course, all of these programs are important, but perhaps the most important factor to helping with affordability pressures is actually expanding the housing supply, and particularly the supply of housing types that are affordable to those with more modest incomes. This could include manufactured housing. But this is all happening in an environment, these unique pressures, they're happening in an environment where perhaps scaling the supply is more difficult than in a metro area, in a more connected geography. So, given these challenges, these really unique challenges that rural markets contend with. And in the context of several years of rapidly rising home prices, if migration trends persist to these types of communities, this leaves certain groups just more at risk of deepening affordability challenges. And this is felt most acutely by the local workforce and by long-term residents. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time.
Thank you, Peyton, and thank you, Alex. There's so much to unpack, even more here, and so little time. We've gotten just dozens of really great questions. We will share them with you, and you may want to respond. Um, let me start actually where you ended. And it's a little bit speculative, which is always hard to do for people who are as good at data as the two of you. But you said if migration trends persist, and there were a bunch of questions saying, uh, one, what do we know anything about the impact of kind of the push for return to work? And then a couple of people went even farther saying, what do we think the impact of AI might be, given that a lot of the folks who moved were often tech reliant, or involved in tech. Um, so I guess either I don't know if you've seen any data on either prices or migration, or what are you going to be looking for over the next couple of years to see what if any impact these might have.
Don't go too easy on us, David, please. Um, so I think a couple things in response to that, a couple things in mind at least. And I showed early in the presentation the continued domestic migration trends, right? So there was a period of at least a decade where more residents left rural areas than came in, and that shifted in 2021 pretty sharply, and more people started to come into rural areas. And that's persistent. That positive trend has continued into the most recent data. There's no reason right now to think that's stops, but right, like obviously it could, and it's not going to be true in all places. But we also know in general and everywhere that the home buying market has slowed down and has slowed down sharply, right? So think about some of the trends that we talked about in terms of interest rates, in terms of housing supply and the available supply. Those trends were true in 2020, 2021, and into 2022 to a certain extent, and are just not true now. So the home buying market has slowed down sharply. And if you look across the country, home prices are just not rising to the same extent. Um, and some of those inputs, especially interest rates, really weigh on the second home market also, right? So if anything, I mean, certainly we know that home prices have not even have like come down sharply, but aren't rising nearly to the same extent in rural areas as they were. Um, um, but the relative differences across geographies, I think, is a good, interesting question worth thinking about. But I don't know that we know really off the top of our heads.
I was about to ask you, do we know, are they rising any faster or slower than other areas? But maybe we'll have to wait for the State of the Nation's housing report.
Yeah, yeah. Rather than me spit out theories, I think that
Yeah,
makes a lot of
yeah.
sense.
Um, a couple questions came up that are trying to see if we can further unpack um, the nature of the change, and one has to do with people and one has to do with structures, and let me see if I can combine them. Um, and I guess maybe starting by saying, you make this really interesting distinction between vacation counties and non-vacation counties. Um, and I think there is a list. Somebody asked if the list of those counties are available, and I believe the answer is yes, but you can check. Did the population change that you showed in general for rural areas, was it greater or less in the vacation counties? And I guess part of that question says that we would think the vacation counties would be the home of more of the second home slash vacation slash rental buyers, and therefore they might have seen house prices increase, but not necessarily population. So is there any way to distinguish both between the two types of areas in terms of overall population growth and any information on kind of what the composition of that growth might have looked like?
You want to take this, Payne? You spoke to this a little bit.
Sorry, so you're asking about
So is really two questions here. Is there a
mhm.
difference in the rate of population growth for vacation counties versus non-vacation counties?
Yeah. I'm not, yeah, I believe I showed a chart earlier in the
I might
presentation.
have missed it. I
Maybe
apologize.
I I'm sure
Yeah,
I went by
yeah,
it too quickly.
yeah,
But yeah, certainly there were much higher rates of um migration to vacation
yeah,
counties in the pandemic period. Although both types of rural counties did experience significant shifting increases in
okay.
migration, but it
Okay.
was certainly elevated in
It-
vacation
it-
counties that we
So,
noticed.
so that would suggest, even though we know that second home buyers, because if it's my second home, that's not going to be my primary residence. So it wasn't just the rise in house prices wasn't just
Yes.
driven primarily by second home buyers.
Yes, and that's part of it. That's part of the story, right? But it's not
Yeah,
just that. And just to put right, the rate of domestic
yeah,
migration in that 2021 to 2023 period in vacation counties was about three times higher than the rate of domestic migration in non-vacation
yeah,
counties.
yeah,
And also to add to that quickly, Peyton also spoke about the composition of some of these households into vacation counties. These tended to be, on average, much higher income,
yes.
even like right, compared to non-vacation counties, certainly, but even compared to home buyers in metro areas, which we talked about a little bit, and it shows up in the paper a bit more. So these
Mhm.
tend to not only be, you see this much larger increase in migration into these areas, but from what we know about who they are also higher income folks.
The in some of my mind, a related question was, were you able to, or is it possible to kind of break out within the vacation counties any differences in the growth in house prices by housing stock? So that at least some folks were asking, saying, well, maybe it's sort of the big homes that are located in the particularly desirable part of that area, having spent, some time in some of the parts of Maine that you highlighted. You've got beautiful lakefront houses, and then 2 miles away, you may have a manufactured housing community. Is there any reason to believe that prices rose kind of equally across those, or was there some distribution?
So one weakness of our analysis, we're looking at counties overall and how
Yeah.
home price trends in those counties change. So it's a little hard to disentangle and disimpact within communities where the home prices or for what kinds of housing. So we can't quite look at that. I will say, you look at differences across communities, even across different kinds of vacation counties. That's some of what those regression models that Peyton presented can really speak to. Right. So if you look at, and you could tell a story, I think, about these regression models that are really about what did people prioritize and where did home prices rise most, right? So what did people prioritize? They prioritize the kinds of amenities, the kinds of natural amenities that vacation counties offered. But really also at the same time, even with that, people prioritize places that were kind of close to metro areas, right? Like they didn't want to be so far afield, so far out there, right? And they appreciated and valued lower density communities overall, right? So it's this combination of things that people really valued, but that's not true within communities necessarily. We're looking at differences across communities, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then one last of the sort of differences was, did you see any differences in kind of the types of buyers? So a couple questions about,
Mm.
uh, during the pandemic in particular, there was this, huge surge of corporate buyers essentially buying up rental, houses primarily to rent. Um, or I guess the other one would be, any sense of mortgage, houses that were funded by mortgages versus all cash purchases. So any interesting patterns in kind of
Yeah.
who was buying as best you could figure out.
So it's not something we looked at too much or addressed too much. We do know that the rates of cash purchases are going to be higher in non-metro areas overall, and I think in these county these vacation counties in particular,
Mhm.
which is actually a weakness of some of the data that we're using in some
Yeah.
cases that we didn't quite get a chance to touch on. But when you look at and from other work we know and that we've done, right, not necessarily related to this project, when you look at like rates of corporate buyers and corporate purchasers of homes across the country, they tend to be concentrated more in urban areas actually, and in
Mhm.
select urban areas, especially places in the Sun Belt, right? Not necessarily the vacation areas that we're looking at. But that doesn't mean that's not a challenge in particular vacation home communities, where it definitely is, but it wasn't a focus of our study
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah, I would expect in at least some of those communities you would have seen a pretty significant rise in kind of the short-term rental market
Yeah,
and stuff like
I think
that.
I'm skeptical at times of what that means in certain markets, certainly, right? But when you think about vacation areas that have a restricted housing stock already, right,
Yeah.
and maybe more incentives to kind of like buy and rent out, absolutely, it's a particular challenge there.
Well, we haven't hit the end of the questions, but we have hit the end of our time. I just want to know, I mean, for me, this is kind of a classic, wonderful piece of what the Joint Center does, which is, we all know anecdotally, of folks moving during the pandemic. We were seeing this, we were seeing anecdotal accounts, and just again, having read the paper, but now listening to you present it, the kind of careful analysis that really said, well, what can we figure out, given what data we can access, what can we actually say about what happened, why, where, and really unpack it, I think has been huge. It will, as many folks speculated, I think be fascinating to see how this plays out over time, given both the pushback to return to work and the rise of things like AI, but also the what clearly has shown a desire of folks to live in these communities. So I want to thank you both for a terrific presentation, and for just again bringing that rigor to the work of the Joint Center. Remind folks that a video of this talk, along with the slides, will be posted on the Joint Center's website by early next week, and the paper itself is already on the website. So I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Alex and Peyton, thank you very, very much.
Thank you,
Have
David.
a great day, everybody.
Thank you, David.